Hello, everyone. Let's talk about the Huizinga piece. Huizinga's piece is called The Nature and Significance of Play. I think it's quite a bit different from the other pieces that we are going to read throughout the course. One, because I don't think it offers a lot of argumentation in rigid step by step form, but also it's more prosaic and the wording is a little bit more flowery, which is fine. But I think there are certain areas that I'm going to flag for you in which I think he could have offered more clarification or he could have gone more in depth on what exactly he means. He starts with the idea that play is older than human culture. The fact that animals display play behavior all the time, dogs play with each other, cats play with each other, probably less so in the case of cats, but wild animals play with each other. They all demonstrate different types of play. They demonstrate different ways of playing. Say, if it's an old animal with a younger animal or two of the same age, they might play differently. And it's prevalent throughout all of the animal kingdom, including human beings. And this is an important point for Huizinga because it predates human culture. And so explanations that rely on human use or functionality of play are not going to get at what play is functionally doing. And what it means to give a functional argument in evolutionary terms is, why did we develop this capacity for play? What is it about play that helps human beings survive, or rather, helps a certain species survive over and above those that might not have the capacity or desire to play? He offers a few popular functional accounts of play, including a discharge of superabundant vital energy, the fact that it satisfies an imitative instinct, a need for relaxation, a training a creature for future work that will be required of it. These are all possibilities to explain the existence of play in a way that says, here's an advantage that play gives a creature or a species over its rivals that don't have that capacity or ability or desire. So if someone needs to discharge a bunch of energy they have in a productive way, they might be able to do it through play. Or perhaps it is I think this account has become pretty popular in the evolutionary biology literature, that it's sort of training for adult-like behaviors. You might have played house when you were younger, or you might have played that you were working somewhere. And the idea is that it's training you for behaviors and activities and skills that you're going to need when you are older. These aren't mutually exclusive accounts, these functional accounts. You could combine a bunch of them and there's nothing that's intrinsically contradictory about them. But Huizinga thinks that they don't get at the core of what he's after. And that is, if you could say about any of these accounts, you could say, sure, I get that it provides a creature with a need for relaxation, but why is it fun? What is it about play that's fun? And he says none of these functional accounts actually get at that. And I think what Huizinga is trying to do here is give us a better concept of play so that we can begin to think about, if it can at all, how to fit it in empirically in our theories. So let's move on and talk about the several characteristics of play that Huizinga notes. The first characteristic that Huizinga notes is that play is a voluntary activity. It's not something you can be forced into. And this is one of those places where I want to flag, because the next quote he says is something like, it is free, it is freedom. Play is freedom. And I don't know what that means exactly. I don't know what it means to say that play is freedom. I could see freedom, the voluntary activity being a necessary part of engaging in play, but I don't know what it means to say that play is in fact freedom as an identity statement. Play is something that cannot be forced. It's a voluntary act. But to say that play is freedom, I'm not quite sure what that means. If you have thoughts or ideas about this, I'd be more than happy to hear them. The second characteristic of play that Huizinga offers us is that play is not part of ordinary or real life. It is a stepping out. So when we engage in play, we are stepping out or stepping aside from our real life to engage in make-believe or some sort of separate world from our normal everyday lives. And you could think about this both in the terms of like as a little kid, like stepping into imagination land or whatever, right? Or playing, again, going back to playing house where you're acting in another role, but also just when playing sports or games, you're operating under a different set of rules and you're sort of referring, thinking ahead to suits. You're giving that per-losery goal and you're coming in with the losery attitude of a game player, qua game player. You're engaging in a different sort of life or reality than you normally would. The third characteristic that Huizinga gives us is that play is secluded. And he means secluded here in terms of time and space. So there's both a boundary in the time in which one plays. So there's we're playing now, we're not playing. And that's a, firm boundary. But there's also a set space, whether it's a playing field, whether it's a certain, part of the house, it's a game board, whatever the case may be, you can think of there's certain boundaries that designate the area both in time and space for play. The fourth characteristic that Huizinga gives us is that play creates and demands order. So in order to engage in play, and again, we see this in Suits, and we see this in Holt and discussions further down the line, that rules are crucial to game playing. In order to actually play a game, you have to follow the rules, and you have to stay within the bounds of the game. Otherwise, you're either doing something like cheating, or you're just not engaging with the game, not playing the game at all. And here, Huizinga is pointing out that not just games, but all types of play seem to demand a similar thing. Again, here, I want to flag this part again because he says play is order. And not only do I'm not quite sure what that means, but I also think that lots of types of play don't necessarily seem to demand order at all. In fact, some types of play seem to eschew order completely. I'm thinking here of like riffing in music or doing some sort of sports warm up where you're just sort of doing random skills in random order. I don't quite think those demand order or structure in the same way that Huizinga thinks play does broadly. And even like animals playing with each other, like what does it mean to say that demands order or is order? Again, love to hear your thoughts on this, and I'm not trying to disparage Huizinga here. Rather, I'm trying to show you the types of thought processes that philosophers go through when they're examining a text like this. The fifth characteristic of play, according to Huizinga, is that it has no material interest and no profit can be gained from it. I don't think we need to go into this too much. I think you might think about things like arcades or places where people go to play something and there's a profit gained from it and think, is that a counterexample of this? But I think what Huizinga is referring to here is that the people engaging in play are not in it to make a profit. Again, people playing sports, are they playing and getting a profit from it? Again, I'm not really sure what Huizinga would say on those accounts, but you can think of the basic type of nature of play as not being materially interested or not being interested in making a profit. Perhaps it's possible, but maybe it's just not the essential characteristic of play, and that's understandable. The sixth characteristic that Huizinga offers us is that play is veiled in secrecy and differentness. I'm not so sure about the secrecy. He argues that people, form groups and have sort of secret chats about their interests. But I do understand the differentness part, right? We all sort of identify by what we like to play in terms of there's lots of sports clubs, game clubs, other activities that involve play clubs like drama clubs. And to kids, when they're younger, often when they're playing, they form these little groups and in-groups and out-groups, and you can be a part or not be a part. This sort of in-group, out-group behavior is common in a lot of societal and cultural aspects, not just play, but you certainly see it represented in play as well. So those are the characteristics of play that Huizinga offers us. And we'll wrap up the discussion of the paper here. I sort of gave you this whirlwind quick tour of Huizinga's piece, but Again, I want to flag both the differences that this paper is going to display compared to other papers that we are going to read, but also that I think it's really well written and it was kind of a joy to read compared to maybe some of the more drier technical articles that we'll see later on. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I'd be happy to hear any feedback or questions you have on the Huizenga piece. But now let's move on to suits and the definition of sport. A voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. So putting obstacles in our way and overcoming them through skill. And we'll see later exactly what type of skill and what other characteristics are required in order for a game to be a sport. But first, we need to talk about the pre-illusory goal, the illusory means, and the illusory attitude, which Suits thinks is essential for games. So a pre-illusory goal is the bringing about of a specific state of affairs, so hitting a golf ball into a cup or crossing a finish line, etc. And this goal, importantly, does not include how it is to be brought about. So it doesn't include exactly how you're supposed to get to that goal, because that is going to be captured by the illusory means, which are the specific rules and conditions in which a player can reach the pre-illusory goal according to the structure of the game. So you might reach the pre-illusory goal by cheating, for example, or by doing something that is out of the bounds, out of the realm of the game. This is not going to be playing the game, but it's going to be doing something else, right? So the thought is that in order to play the game, you need both the pre-illusory goal, the object or the goal to win the game, and the structure or rules that surround the game telling you how it is you get to that pre-illusory goal. In order to play the game, you also need to have the illusory attitude. Not the loser attitude, right, Bob, but the attitude of game players qua game players, or game players as game players. And this is the thought that in order to engage in the game, you have to put yourself in the attitude of wanting that pre-illusory goal, but only through those illusory means. You might, if you've ever seen The Office, you've probably watched the clip where they're doing that 5K run for rabies, and instead of running the race like everyone else, a few of them get in a car and skip most of it and drive back around the block or whatever back to the office. That's not having the right illusory attitude for the pre-illusory goal of finishing a 5K. So those are the conditions by which Suits thinks a game is being played. Now, what makes a game a sport? We will look at those characteristics now. Suits has given us the structure of a game through the three components earlier. Now we are looking at what games are also sports, and this has the following four requirements in order for a game to also be a sport. First is that the game must be a game of skill. It can't be a game of just chance or pure luck. For example, slots or something at the casino. He gives the grim example of Russian roulette, but all these are games of pure chance. They don't involve skill and therefore cannot be sports. He doesn't want to include things like poker, where there is an element of luck, but there's also skill in reading your opponent, in knowing the probability of various cards appearing, in knowing the probability of your opponent having a certain hand. There's a lot of skills involved in poker, and perhaps other casino games that we can talk about in the discussion or something, but the basic thing he wants to limit is that games of pure chance are not sports. Secondly, the skill that is involved must be physical. It can't be something like chess, where the skill is almost entirely mental, about strategizing, about memorizing patterns of movements, thinking about win probability in terms of different moves on the board and their options, or something like memory Olympics or memory competitions where you have to remember a certain amount of words or numbers or terms. It has to be physical, according to Suits. The third characteristic is that the game have a wide following. This is to avoid examples where one or two people know about this sport and maybe are devoted to something like his example of Sweatbeat. He doesn't want games that have a fan base or engagement audience of a few people to be counted as legitimate instances of sport. So it has to have a wide following. And in addition, that following has to achieve a certain level of stability. So things like hula hooping or other fads that come and go aren't going to count as legitimate instances of sports because they simply do not have the level of stability that other sports do. We'll see in Holt some reasons for doubting this, what's called an institutional definition of sport, where it relies on the notion of a wide following and a stable following. But here you can see what Suits is at least getting at by requiring additional things of games in order to be considered sports. And we get this pretty easy metric then of when to acknowledge something as a sport versus just a game. There's going to be levels of, you might think like, especially with the wide following or how physical a skill is, there's going to be a gradient. But that doesn't mean that we can't categorize something as a sport or not. We just have to accept that there's going to be sort of this fuzziness or these blurry lines at the borders of our concepts. But that's always going to be true, almost no matter how technical the concept is, unless it's something more like logic or mathematics. And even in mathematics, there can be fuzzy borders, but we don't need to talk about that now. You can see that Suits has offered us this characteristics of a game and then tried to define sport as additional requirements on top of the characteristics of a game. So that Suits in a nutshell. Let's go ahead and look at Holt and about the question whether or not esports or cybersports ought to be considered a sport. Hello everyone, my audio and video for this section of Holt got corrupted, so I'm just doing a quick voiceover with an empty screen here, but essentially I just reiterated the first part of the notes that some people think that cybersports ought to be considered a sport because they involve things like the development of sport intelligence. This is Hemphill's idea, right? And the thought that perhaps something like the distinction between fine and gross motor skills is not appropriate way of determining whether or not esports are sports. And in the following, I'm going to explain Holt's response to this and explain why he thinks something like the domain of application and execution is the relevant way of determining whether or not a cyber sport or game is a sport at all. Sorry for this poor quality little part here, but we will get back to at least slightly better quality. Thanks. The distinction between fine and gross motor skills is essentially the difference between something like hand dexterity and running a sprint, right? Fine motor skills require limited or particular parts of the body. They don't incorporate a whole lot of muscle groups. They're maybe isolated to just the hand and maybe the forearm. The gross motor skills are skills that involve the whole body. They involve large muscle groups and motor skills of that magnitude. Hemphill and Meyer argue that when people try to distinguish between games and sports by using this distinction, and this is something that is in the philosophy of sport literature, but we don't need to rehash the whole history here. What's important is that people have said if something requires gross motor skills, it's a sport. If it's just fine motor skills, it's a game. Hemphill and Meyer suggest that the boundary isn't that clear, and we don't need to go in, we don't need to go into the specifics of why they think so, but they think it's much more blurry, the line between fine and gross motor skills, and that it's not a useful way of distinguishing between sports and games. Holt thinks he disagrees with their assessment of how to differentiate between them, or rather, he disagrees with the fact that it's as fuzzy as they make it out to be, the border between fine and gross motor skills. But he suggests that, fine, even if it was, think about this. Think about paradigm instances of fine motor skills and paradigm instances of gross motor skills. The ones that tend towards gross motor skills are going to be more core instances of sport. They're going to be less controversial when trying to argue that it's a sport. Whereas the fine motor skills ones, you're going to have to make a more compelling case, he thinks. And perhaps in our, everyday common judgments of what counts as a sport and not, we can maybe or maybe not see that reflected in our attitudes. Thinking about chess versus thinking about sprinting, or thinking about bowling versus thinking about sprinting. But you can think for yourself about whether or not that distinction is a good one, and whether or not it ought to be applied here. The crux of Holt's piece, where he's really contributing to this argument, is the domain of execution and the domain of application of a skill. So he is going to make the argument that the domain of application and the domain of execution in a physical sport is always the same place. It's the playing field. It's the physical space in which the game is being played. To get more clear on this, we can talk about an example and what these domains mean. So the domain of execution is always going to be what he calls subject specific. This is a matter of where the agent's skilled movement is meant to occur. The domain of application is object specific. It's where the action's outcome is meant to obtain. So he uses this example of a bowling alley, right? We can think about, I'm bowling on lane number 1, and if I'm playing right, the domain of execution and the domain of application are going to both be lane number 1. Now, if I had the domain of application in lane number 3, I'm not playing bowling right. I'm not actually doing the skill that's asked of me, right? If I toss a ball over 2 lanes, that's not, I'm not fulfilling the activity or the prelusory goal, to refer back to Suits. And Holt thinks in ordinary sports, these are always the same, right? As we said. But in virtual sports, these come apart. And that is because the domain of execution is physical still, but the domain of application is virtual. And it's not only a different place, physical place, but it's also a different type of reality, Holt thinks. It's a whole different, it's a virtual reality rather than a physical one. And he thinks that this can't, the fact that it separates in cases of virtual sport mean that virtual sports are not legitimate cases of sport. He doesn't quite give us an argument for why we should think the difference of domain matters here. What I mean by that is, I agree with him that in ordinary sports, or sports that we have come to realize hold as sports, the core instances as Holt calls them, they do have the same application and execution domains. But why think that that's a necessary thing of sports rather than something that all sports share at the moment? Because computers are relatively new on the scene, and the fact that they exist is a huge technological advancement that is sure to shape a lot of our concepts. And why shouldn't it shape this concept of the domains being requirements of sports? Holt sort of makes this point himself later when he's talking about the domain of application and execution for like writing a paper on a word processing software. He suggests that the fact that we're becoming more and more familiar with computers, we don't really distinguish that heavily between typing up a Word document on a computer versus typing up on a typewriter. If anyone still, I'm sure there are people that still do that, but we don't make a huge difference between those types of realities. I'm not mystified by the fact that I'm typing up on a word processor. And he sort of hints that this might be the case for cyber sports in general, but he doesn't really pursue that more. And I want to note that, because I think that's an important point here, is that he's making this argument that the domains don't match, therefore it's not a sport, but we don't really get the reason why domains are a crucial element of his definition of sport. He makes some comments about the rules and how they differ between, say, games and video games and sports. The suggestion is that in sports, you can break rules because the rules are, it's physically possible to break them. I can foul someone or I can step out of bounds. But a video game, the rules, he thinks, are sort of built into the way that the game is programmed, the way it's written. I can't unless I have cheat codes or I go in and manipulate, the code with a mod or something. I can't break the rules of the game. Again, here I want to press back a little bit, and I hope I'm lecturing, but I also want to, sort of show you the way of the philosophical method of hearing an argument and thinking about possible responses to it. One way of thinking, or one way of responding to Holt here, I think, is as someone who's a fan of esports, and I don't mean to say that I want them to count as genuine instances of sport, but just someone who has watched some. A lot of the leagues or the ones that might, be considered sports have rules that go over and above the code of the game, like how the game is written. They have, certain rules about the kind of matches that are going to be played, or the kind of in-game equipment that's allowed to be used, or the kind of equipment that's allowed to be used externally. Well, that's certainly true. But also, different rules about the composition of teams, or what characters are playable. Different esport like leagues will have different rules that impart external conditions that actually affect in-game play. So I think that's an example where that goes against what Holt is saying here. And you guys can determine for yourselves, if you think those rules are the right type of rules for a sport or not, but food for thought. But again, I like Holt's piece a lot here, and I think especially the domain stuff is interesting. Whether or not you agree with it, I'm very interested to hear, and hopefully we can talk about it a bit in the discussion forum. Make sure you do the quiz, the discussion board, and the reply, and I'll see you in the video for module number 2. Thank you.